History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 6 European Imperialism and Imperial Rule. The ruling of alien peoples and other lands by Europeans was the most impressive evidence that they ran the world. In spite of continuing argument about what imperialism was and is, it seems helpful to start with the simple notion of direct and formal overlordship, blurred through its boundaries with other forms of power over the non European world, maybe. This neither raises nor answers questions about causes or motives, on which much time, ink, and thought have been spent. From the outset, different and changing causes were at work, and not all the motives involved were unavowable or self deceiving. Imperialism was not the manifestation of only one age, for it has gone on all through history, nor was it peculiar to Europe's relations with non Europeans overseas, for imperial rule had advanced overland as well as across the seas, and some Europeans have ruled others, and some non Europeans have ruled Europeans. Nonetheless, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the word came to be particularly associated with European expansion, and the direct domination of Europeans over the rest of the world had by then become much more obvious than ever before. Although the American revolutions had suggested that the European empire built up over the preceding 3 centuries were in decline, in the next 100 years, European imperialism was carried much further and became more effective than ever before. This happened in two distinguishable phases, and one running down to about 1870 can conveniently be considered first. Some of the old imperial powers then continued to enlarge their empires impressively. Such were Russia, France, and Great Britain. Others stood still or found theirs reduced. These were the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese. The Russian expansion has at first sight something in common both with the American experience of filling up the North American continent and dominating its weaker neighbors, and something with that of the British in India, but was in fact a very special case. To the west, Russia confronted matured, established European states where there was little hope of successful territorial gain. The same was only slightly less true of expansion into Turkish territories of the Danubian regions, for here the interests of other powers were always likely to come into play against Russia and check her in the end. She was much freer to act to the south and eastwards. In both directions, the first 3 quarters of the 19th century brought great acquisitions. A successful war against Persia, 1826 to 1828, led to the establishment of Russian naval power on the Caspian as well as gains of territory in Armenia. In Central Asia, an almost continuous advance into Turkestan and towards the central oases of Bukhara and Khiva culminated in the annexation of the whole of Transcaspia in 1881. In Siberia, aggressive expansion was followed by the exaction of the left bank of the Amur down to the sea from China and the founding in 1860 of Vladivostok, the far eastern capital. Soon after, Russia liquidated its commitments in America by selling Alaska to the United States. This seemed to show it sought to be an Asian and Pacific, but not an American power. The other two dynamic imperial states of this era, France and Great Britain, expanded overseas. Yet many of the British gains were made at the expense of France. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars proving in this respect the final round of the great colonial Anglo French contest of the 18th century. as in 1714 and 1763. Many of Great Britain's acquisitions at a victorious peace in 1850 were intended to reinforce maritime strength. Malta, St. Lucia, the Ionian Islands, the Cape of Good Hope, Mauritius, and Trincomalee were all kept for this reason. Soon afterwards, steamships began to appear in the Royal Navy, and the situation of bases had to take coaling into account. This now led to further acquisitions. In 1839, an internal upheaval in the Ottoman Empire gave the British the opportunity to seize Aden, a base of strategic importance on the route to India, and others were to follow. No power could successfully challenge such action after Trafalgar. It was not that resources did not exist elsewhere, which, had they been assembled, could have wrested naval supremacy from Great Britain. But to do so would have demanded a huge effort. No other nation operated either the number of ships or possessed the bases which could make it worthwhile to challenge this thalassocracy. There were advantages to other nations in having the world's greatest commercial power undertake a policing of the seas from which all could benefit. Naval supremacy guarded the trade, which gave the British colonies participation in the fastest growing commercial system of the age. Already before the American Revolution, British policy had been more encouraging to commercial enterprise than the Spanish or French. Thus, the old colonies themselves had grown in wealth and prosperity, and the later dominions were to benefit. On the other hand, settlement colonies were out of fashion in London after the American Revolution. They were seen mainly as sources of trouble and expense. Yet Great Britain was the only European country sending out new settlers to existing colonies in the early 19th century. And those colonies sometimes drew the mother country into yet further extensions of territorial rule over alien lands. In some acquisitions, notably in South Africa, there can be seen a new concern about strategy and communication with Asia. This is a complicated business. No doubt, American independence and the Monroe Doctrine diminished the attractiveness of the Western Hemisphere as a region of imperial expansion, but the origins of a shift of British interest to the East can be seen before 1783 in the opening up of the South Pacific and in a growing Asian trade. War with the Netherlands, when it was a French satellite, subsequently led to a new British enterprise in Malaya and Indonesia. Above all, there was the steadily deepening British involvement in India. By 1800, the importance of the Indian trade was already a central axiom of British commercial and colonial thinking. By 1850, it has been urged much of the rest of the empire had only been acquired because of the strategical pull exercised by India. By then, too, the extension of British control inside the subcontinent itself was virtually complete. It was and remained the centerpiece of the British imperialism. This had hardly been expected or even feasible. In 1784, the institution of dual control had been accompanied by decisions to resist further acquisition of Indian territory. The experience of American rebellion had reinforced the view that new commitments were to be avoided. Yet, there was a continuing problem, for through its revenue management, the East India Company's affairs inevitably became entangled in native administration and politics. This made it more important than ever to prevent excesses by its individual officers, such as had been tolerable in the early days of private trading. Slowly, agreement emerged that the government of India was of interest to Parliament, not only because it might be a great source of patronage, but also because the government in London had a responsibility for the good government of Indians. there began to be articulated a notion of trusteeship. It should not be surprising that, during a century in which the idea that government should be for the benefit of the governed was gaining ground in Europe, the same principle should be applied sooner or later to rule over colonial peoples. Since the days of Las Casas, exploitation of indigenous peoples had its vociferous critics. In the mid 18th century, a best selling book by Abby Reynal, it went through 30 editions and many translations in 20 years, had put the criticisms of the churchmen into the secular terms of enlightenment and humanitarianism. Against this deep background, Edmund Burke in 1783 put it to the House of Commons in a debate on India that all political power which is set over men ought to be some way or other exercised ultimately for their benefit. The background against which Indian affairs were considered was therefore changing. Across 2 centuries, the awe and amazement inspired by the Mughal court in the first merchants to reach it had given way rapidly to contempt for what was seen on closer acquaintance as backwardness, superstition, and inferiority. But now there were signs of another change. While Clive, the victor of Plassey, never learned to speak with readiness in the Indian tongue, Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India, strove to get a chair of Persian set up at Oxford and encouraged the introduction of the first printing press to India and the making of the first font of a vernacular Bengali type. There was greater appreciation of the complexity and variety of Indian culture. In 1789, there began to be published in Calcutta the first journal of Oriental Studies, Asiatic Researchers. Meanwhile, at the more practical level of government, company judges were already enjoined to follow Islamic law in family cases involving Muslims, while the revenue authorities of Madras both regulated and funded Hindu temples and festivals. From 1806, Indian languages were taught at East India Company's College, Haileybury. The periodic renewals of the company's charter took place, therefore, in the light of changing influences and assumptions about Anglo Indian relationships. Meanwhile, government's responsibilities grew. In 1813, renewal strengthened London's control further and abolished the company's monopoly of trade with India. By then, the wars with French had already led to the extension of British power over South India through annexation and the negotiation of treaties with native rulers, which secured control of their foreign policy. By 1833, when the charter was again renewed, the only important block of territory not ruled directly or indirectly by the company was in the northwest. The annexation of the Punjab and Sindh followed in the 1840s, and with their paramountcy established in Kashmir, the British held sway over virtually the whole subcontinent. The company had by then ceased to be a commercial organization and had become a government. In 1833, Charter took away its trading functions, not only those with India but the monopoly of trade with China, and it was confined to an administrative role. In sympathy with current thinking, Asian trade was henceforth to be free trade. The way was open to the consummation of many real and symbolic breaks with India's past and the final incorporation of the subcontinent in the modernizing world. The name of the Mughal emperor was removed from the coinage, but it was more than a symbol that Persian ceased to be the legal language of record and justice. This step not only marked the advance of English as the official language and therefore of English education, but also disturbed the balance of forces between Indian communities. Anglicized Hindus would prove to do better than less enterprising Muslims. In a subcontinent so divided in so many ways, The adoption of English as the language of administration was complemented by the important decision in principle to provide primary education through instructions given in English, few though the Indians would be who received it. At the same time, an enlightened despotism exercised by successive governors general began to impose material and institutional improvement. Roads and canals were built, and the first railway followed in 1853. Legal codes were introduced. English officials for the company's service began to be trained, specially in the college established for this purpose. The first three universities in India were founded in 1857. There were other educational structures too, as far back as 1791. A Scotchman had founded a Sanskrit college at Benares, the lords of Hinduism. Much of the transformation which India was gradually undergoing arose not from the direct work of the government but from the increasing freedom with which these and other agencies were allowed to operate. From 1813, the arrival of missionaries, the company had hitherto kept them out, gradually built up another constituency at home with a stake in what happened in India, often to the embarrassment of official India. Two philosophies, in effect, were competing to make government act positively. Utilitarian looked for the promotion of happiness, evangelical Christians to the salvation of souls. Both were arrogantly sure they knew what was best for India. Both subtly changed British attitudes as time passed. The coming of the steamship had its influence too. It brought India nearer. More Englishmen and Scotsmen began to live and make their careers there. This gradually transformed the nature of the British presence. The comparatively few officers of the 18th century company had been content to live the lives of exiles, seeking rewards in their commercial opportunities and relaxation in a social life, sometimes closely integrated with that of the Indians. They often lived much in the style of Indian gentlemen, some of them taking to Indian dress and food, some to Indian wives and concubines. Reform minded officials intent on the eradication of the backward and barbaric in native practice, and in such practices as female infanticide and sutti. They had good cause for concern. Missionaries with a creed to preach which was corrosive of the whole structure of Hindu or Muslim society, and above all, the English women who arrived to make homes in India while their husbands worked there, often did not approve of the old ways of John Company's man. They changed the temper of the British community, which drew more and more apart from the natives, more and more convinced of a moral superiority which sanctioned the ruling of Indians who were culturally and morally inferior. The rulers grew consciously more alien from those they ruled. One of them spoke approvingly of his countrymen as representatives of a belligerent civilization and defined their task as the introduction of the essential parts of European civilization into a country densely peopled, grossly ignorant, steeped in idolatrous superstition, unenergetic, fatalistic, indifferent to most of what we regard as the evils of life, and preferring the response of submitting to them to the trouble of encountering and trying to remove them. This robust creed was far from that of the Englishmen of the previous century, who had innocently sought to do no more in India than make money. Now, while new laws antagonized powerful native interests, the British had less and less social contact with Indians. More and more, they confined the educated Indian to the lower ranks of the administration and withdrew into an enclosed but conspicuously privileged life of their own. Earlier conquerors had been absorbed by Indian society in greater or lesser measure. The Victorian British, thanks to a modern technology, which continuously renewed their contacts with the homeland, and their confidence in their intellectual and religious superiority remained immune, increasingly aloof as no earlier conqueror had been. They could not be untouched by India, as many legacies to the English language and the English breakfast and dinner table still testify, but they created a civilization that confronted India as a challenge, though not wholly English. Anglo Indian in the 19th century was a word applied not to persons of mixed blood, but to Englishmen who made careers in India, and it indicated a cultural and social distinctiveness. The separateness of Anglo Indian society from India was made virtually absolute by the appalling damage done to British confidence by the rebellions of 1857, called the Indian Mutiny. Essentially, this was a chain reaction of outbreaks initiated by a mutiny of Hindu soldiers who feared the polluting effect of using a new type of cartridge greased with animal fat. This detail is significant. Much of the rebellion was the spontaneous and reactionary response of traditional society to innovation and modernization. By way of reinforcement, there were the irritations of native rulers, both Muslim and Hindu, who regretted the loss of their privileges and thought that the chance might have come to recover their independence. The British were, after all, very few. The response of those few was prompt and ruthless. With the help of loyal Indian soldiers and workers, the rebellions were crushed, though not before there had been some massacres of British captives and a British force had been under the siege at Lucknow in rebel territory for some months. The mutiny and its suppression were disasters for British India, though not quite unmitigated. It did not much matter that the Mughal Empire was at last formally brought to an end by the British. The Delhi mutineers had proclaimed the last emperor their leader. Nor was there, as later Indian nationalists were to suggest, a crushing of a national liberation movement whose end was a tragedy for India. Like many episodes important in the making of nations, the mutiny was to be important as a myth and an inspiration. What it was later believed to have been was more important than what it actually was, a jumble of essentially reactionary protests. Its really disastrous and important effect was the wound it gave to British goodwill and confidence. Whatever the expressed intentions of British policy, the consciousness of the British in India was from this time suffused by the memory that Indians had once proved almost fatally untrustworthy. Among Anglo Indians as well as Indians, the mythical importance of the mutiny grew with time. The atrocities actually committed were bad enough, but others which had never occurred were also alleged as grounds for a policy of repression and social exclusiveness. Immediately and institutionally, the mutiny also marked an epoch because it ended the government of the company. The Governor General now became the Queen's Viceroy, responsible to a British cabinet minister. This structure provided the framework of the British Raj for its life of 90 years. The mutiny thus changed Indian history, but by thrusting it more firmly in a direction to which it already tended. Another fact which was equally revolutionary for India was much more gradual in its effects. This was the 19th century flowering of the economic connection with Great Britain. Commerce was the root of the British presence in the subcontinent, and it continued to shape its destiny. The first major development came when India became the essential base for the China trade. Its greatest expansion came in the 1830s and 1840s, when, for a number of reasons, access to China became much easier. It was at about the same time that there took place the first rapid rise in British exports to India, notably of textiles, so that by the time of the mutiny, a big Indian commercial interest existed which involved many more Englishmen and English commercial houses than the old company had ever done. The story of Anglo Indian trade was now locked into that of the great general expansion of British manufacturing supremacy and world commerce. The Suez Canal brought down the costs of shipping goods to Asia by a huge factor. By the end of the century, the volume of the British trade with India had more than quadrupled. The effects were felt in both countries, but were decisive in India, where a check was imposed on an industrialization which might have gone ahead more rapidly without British competition. Paradoxically, the growth of trade thus delayed India's modernization and alienation from its own past. But there were other forces at work too. By the end of the century, the framework provided by the Raj and the stimulus of the cultural influences it permitted had already made impossible the survival of a wholly unmodernized India. No other nation in the early 19th century so extended its imperial possessions as Great Britain, but the French had also made substantial additions to the empire with which they had been left in 1815. In the next half century, France's interests elsewhere, in West Africa and the South Pacific, for example, were not lost to sight, but the first clear sign of a reviving French imperialism came in Algeria. The whole of North Africa was open to imperial expansion by European predators because of the decay there of the formal overlordship of the Ottoman Sultan. Right around the southern and eastern Mediterranean coasts, the issue was posed of a possible Turkish partition. French interest in the area was natural. It went back to a great extension of the country's Levant trade in the 18th century. But a more precise marker had been the expedition to Egypt under Bonaparte in 1798, which opened the question of the Ottoman succession in its extra European sphere. Algeria's conquest began uncertainly in 1830, a series of wars not only with its native inhabitants but with the Sultan of Morocco followed until, by 1870, most of the country had been subdued. This was, in fact, to open a new phase of expansion, for the French then turned their attention to Tunis, which accepted a French protectorate in 1881. To both these sometime Ottoman dependencies, there now began a steady flow of European immigrants, not only from France but from Italy and later Spain. This built up substantial settler populations in a few cities, which were to complicate the story of French rule. The day was past when the African Algerian might have been exterminated or all but exterminated like the Aztec, American Indian, or Australian Aborigine. His society, in any case, was more resistant, formed in the crucible of an Islamic civilization which had once contested so successfully with Christendom. Nonetheless, he suffered notably from the introduction of land law, which broke up his traditional usages and impoverished the peasant by exposing him to the full blast of market economics. At the eastern end of the African littoral, a national awakening in Egypt led to the emergence there of the first great modernizing nationalist leader outside the European world, Mehmet Ali, Pasha of Egypt. Admiring Europe, he sought to borrow its ideas and techniques while asserting his independence of Sultan. When he was later called upon for help by the Sultan against the Greek Revolution, Mehmet Ali went on to attempt to seize Syria as his reward. This threat to the Ottoman Empire provoked an international crisis in the 1830s, in which the French took his side. They were not successful, but thereafter, French policy continued to entrust itself in the Levant and Syria too, an interest which was eventually to bear fruit in the brief establishment in the 20th century of a French presence in the area.